Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, three nations that broke away from the West's oldest security framework in the Sahel and built their own from scratch. It's called the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES. It started 3 years ago as a defensive military pact between three military governments nobody expected to survive. Today, up to 8 more African nations, Guinea, Chad, Mauritania, Togo, the Central African Republic, Sudan, South Sudan, and even Algeria are being watched closely for signs of alignment with it. Why does this matter beyond 3 landlocked capitals in West Africa? Because for the first time in decades, a group of African governments is openly rejecting the old rules of the game, the currency arrangements, the military basing agreements, the regional bodies, and daring to ask what happens if they simply build their own instead. This is the story of how Captain Ibrahim Traore and his counterparts turned a security pact into something much bigger. A movement built around one word, sovereignty. In the next few minutes, you'll see how this alliance is rebuilding its military, its money, its industries, and its borders all at once. You'll see where it's already delivering results and where it's still being tested by an enemy that hasn't gone anywhere. And you'll see why capitals from N'Djamena to Conakry to Algiers are now watching this experiment closely enough to consider joining it. Quick shout out before we dive in. This video is supported by our members at Alfred Saki, at Jebri Muhammad, and at Howard Sweeney. Thank you for backing independent journalism. If you want to help this channel keep digging into stories the mainstream won't touch, join them, link below. To understand what the AES is fighting for, you have to see what came before it. For over a decade, the region ran through the G5 Sahel, a joint security framework built with Mauritania, Chad, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, headquartered in Nouakchott, backed by French and Western funding. On paper, it was cooperation. In practice, it was dependency wearing a uniform. Foreign officers helped plan operations. Foreign donors decided which equipment got funded and which didn't. And through it all, a currency printed and guaranteed outside the region, the CFA franc, still governed how each of these economies could spend, borrow, and grow. Coups swept through the region, Mali in 2020 and 2021, Burkina Faso in 2022, Niger in 2023. Each new military government inherited the same broken equation. French troops on the ground, jihadist violence rising anyway, and a civilian population that had stopped believing outside intervention was actually working. The numbers tell the human cost. In Burkina Faso alone, more than 7,500 violent deaths and 1.6 million people displaced between 2015 and 2021, and that toll has only climbed since. This wasn't a statistic on a foreign ministry briefing slide. This was villages emptied overnight, farmers who stopped planting fields near contested roads, children who stopped walking to schools that closed for the 3rd, 4th, 5th time. For years, the promise from Paris and from Western capitals was the same. Stay the course, trust the process, security will come. It didn't come. And by the early 2020s, patience across the region had run out. By December 2023, Burkina Faso and Niger had formally withdrawn from the G5 Sahel. Within days, the remaining members dissolved what was left of it. The old framework didn't just weaken, it collapsed. That collapse is the origin point. Out of the wreckage of a security pact that failed to secure anything, 3 governments decided to build something of their own, not just a new army coalition, but eventually an entirely new political project. What would that project actually look like? That's where the real conflict of this story begins. It's worth pausing here on what these 3 countries actually share beyond a common enemy in the insurgency. All 3 are landlocked. All 3 depend on neighboring ports in Togo, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, just to move goods to and from the sea. All 3 inherit colonial-era borders that split ethnic and trading communities across multiple modern states, communities that had moved freely across this land for centuries before those borders existed, and all three, going into the 2020s, ranked among the poorest nations on earth by per capita income, despite sitting on some of the richest mineral and agricultural resources in West Africa: gold, uranium, cotton, livestock. That contradiction, resource-rich, income-poor, is the quiet engine driving everything that follows in this story. It's the reason sovereignty for these governments was never going to stay a purely military word. The Western security establishment expected the AES to fracture within a year. It didn't, and the story of why is a story of but/therefore, repeated again and again. The old order tried to keep these nations tied to the CFA franc, to French military bases, to ECOWAS oversight. But the military leaders walked away, formally exiting ECOWAS in January 2024, and therefore had to build parallel institutions from scratch. A joint AES force, a proposed common passport, talks of a shared currency to eventually replace the CFA franc altogether. The enemy of progress in this telling isn't a single country, it's structural dependency itself. Decades of monetary policy set outside the region. Decades of security architect designed and commanded from outside capitals. The hero of sovereignty is the physical, visible alternative being built to replace it. Joint AES military convoys moving across borders without needing a foreign flag's permission. National radio broadcasts announcing withdrawal from the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, Mali first in March 2025, with Burkina Faso and Niger following the same trajectory. But building sovereignty and building security are not the same fight, and this is where the tension escalates. JNIM, Al-Qaeda's Sahel affiliate, didn't retreat when the new military leaders took power. It adapted. It has expanded southward, threatening trade corridors into northern Benin, Togo, and Ghana, and it struck deep into territory once considered safe. A raid on Bamako itself in September 2024, and a coordinated attack on the northern Burkinabe town of Djibo in May 2025 that killed dozens of soldiers and civilians in a single night. Therefore, the AES had to prove its unified force could do what the G5 Sahel couldn't: deliver actual battlefield results, not just political unity. In May 2024, forces from Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Togo ran a joint exercise, Tarhanakal, staged in Tilia, Niger, testing whether these militaries could actually pool resources and coordinate operations under one banner instead of 5 competing chains of command. It was a small technical exercise, but it was also a proof of concept that regional militaries, even ones that don't always trust each other's governments, can still train and fight side by side when the mission is shared. That test is still running in real time, and it's the single biggest question mark hanging over the entire project. A shared flag on a convoy means little if the insurgency keeps expanding underneath it. There's a second front in this tension, the diplomatic one. Relations with Algeria froze entirely after all 3 AES states cut ties with Algiers. Burkina Faso has accused neighboring Côte d'Ivoire of harboring destabilization plots. Niger has leveled similar accusations at Benin. These aren't abstract disputes. They are open wounds between neighbors who share borders, trade routes, and in many cases, the exact same insurgent threat. So how does an alliance under diplomatic siege, fighting an insurgency that keeps adapting, end up attracting new suitors instead of losing the ones it has? Here's the turn. By mid-2026, cracks are showing on the other side of the divide too. Chad's Minister of Communications has publicly called the AES a wonderful experience and said joining would be good for his country. Guinea has quietly deepened ties with the alliance. Public sentiment in Côte d'Ivoire itself, ahead of an October presidential election, shows real appetite for closer relations with the AES bloc, even as the sitting government stays aligned with Paris. Opposition leader has signaled that, if elected, his government would move towards stronger AES ties rather than away from them. Therefore, the alliance that started as 3 isolated, sanctioned governments is now a gravitational center, pulling at neighbors who are supposed to be its rivals. That is not something Western policymakers predicted when the sanctions were first imposed. None of Gandhi. This erases the real criticism. International observers continue to raise legitimate concerns about governance, about the durability of military rule, about human rights records in counter-insurgency operations, about a dependency now shifting toward Russia and its Africa core mercenaries rather than disappearing altogether. Trading one foreign security patron for another is not the same thing as sovereignty, and that contradiction sits at the center of the AES story, unresolved. Supporters of the project make a different argument, that sovereignty was never going to arrive perfectly formed, that the measure of a government isn't whether outsiders approve of it, but whether it can deliver security, economic opportunity, and functioning institutions for its own people, and that judgment has to be made on results, not on optics. Both things can be true at once. That's the tension this documentary refuses to flatten. There's a third dimension to this story that gets far less attention than the soldiers and the sanctions, the money itself. For decades, 14 African countries, including all 3 AES members, have used the CFA franc, a currency pegged to the euro and, until recently, backed by reserves held partly in the French treasury. Supporters of the peg point to the stability it has historically offered. Critics call it monetary sovereignty on loan, with interest paid in political deference. The AES has floated the idea of a common currency to eventually replace the CFA franc across its members, a project still in its early technical stages without a firm timeline. But therefore, in the meantime, each country has taken smaller, faster steps, renegotiating mining contracts to capture more revenue domestically, building processing plants for raw cotton and gold instead of shipping them out unrefined, and directing state budgets toward infrastructure that keeps trade moving inside the bloc rather than out through old colonial-era ports and rail lines built to serve someone else's economy. Picture a truck loaded with raw cotton, once bound for a foreign spinning mill, now rerouted to a domestic mill instead. The same crop, the same farmer, but a different destination and a different country capturing the value added along the way. That's the physical, visible version of what economic sovereignty actually looks like on the ground, away from the flags and the podium speeches. So where does this leave the alliance of Soros states as it enters its 4th year? It is no longer a security experiment. It has become, in the words of analysts watching the region closely, a full political identity, a bloc actively campaigning for African economic independence, urging member states and sympathetic neighbors to stop exporting raw resources and start building the industries to process them at home. Captain Traore's vision, cotton turned into thread rather than shipped raw, gold refined rather than exported unworked, food grown to feed the region rather than to fill foreign supply chains, has become something close to the alliance's economic doctrine. Political independence in this framing means nothing without industrial independence sitting right behind it. That's the pivot the AES is betting its entire future on. That sovereignty isn't just about who commands the soldiers at the border, but about who owns the factory, who processes the raw material, and who keeps the profit at the end of the supply chain. The joint AES force is still being tested against an insurgency that hasn't slowed. That test will not resolve neatly, and this documentary will not pretend otherwise. But the alliance has already outlasted the timeline most outside observers gave it. It has weathered sanctions, isolation from ECOWAS, and open hostility from some neighbors. And it is still standing, still recruiting sympathy from unexpected corners of the region. The African Union has stepped into the gap left by the G5 Sahel's collapse, working to broker dialogue between the AES and its neighbors rather than let the divide harden permanently. Improving relations between Bamako and Algiers and between Niger and Benin suggests the isolation may not be permanent either, that even the sharpest diplomatic ruptures in this story have room to heal. There is even talk of reviving the old Nouakchott process, the African Union's counter-terrorism cooperation mechanism, expanded to include coastal states like Togo, Ghana and Benin that are now facing the same JNIM threat spreading south. If that expansion happens, it would mark something remarkable, a security architecture built not by Paris or Washington, but by African governments themselves, negotiating directly with each other about a threat that respects none of their borders. There's also a generational bet buried inside all of this. Roughly 60% of the population across the AES states is under 25. That's not a footnote, it's the actual audience this entire project is being built for. Every new mill, every kilometer of paved road, every trained battalion is, in the long run, a wager on whether that generation stays home and builds or leaves for opportunities elsewhere. The alliance's leaders talk about sovereignty in terms of flags and currencies, but the number that will ultimately judge them is a much simpler one: how many young people a decade from now chose to stay. What happens next will be decided by results on the ground, not by statements in the capital. Whether the joint force can actually blunt JNIM's advance. Whether Chad, Guinea or others formalize what right now are just warm words. Whether a shared AES currency moves from talking point to reality. And whether industrial projects like cotton processing and gold refining scale up fast enough to actually change household incomes, not just headlines. That is the next chapter of this story, and it's the one worth watching closely, because whichever way it goes, it will shape what sovereignty means for the next generation across the entire continent. Subscribe and stay with us, because we'll be tracking every one of these developments as they happen.